Andrea Pia Kennedy was born on July 2, 1964, in Hallsville, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family. Her parents, Yuta and Andrew, were German and Irish immigrants whose lives revolved around steady work, quiet discipline, and a belief in hard responsibility. Andrea grew up in a modest household, her father employed as an auto shop teacher, her mother working to keep the household together. Being the youngest of 5 meant she often looked to her older siblings for guidance. But even as a child, she carried a seriousness that made her seem older than her years. Teachers described Andrea as bright, focused, and somewhat shy. She wasn't the kind of girl to command attention in classrooms or playgrounds, but she excelled academically and pushed herself toward goals with determination. She gravitated towards science and mathematics, and from early on she imagined herself in a career that would help others. Nursing, with its balance of compassion and technical skill, became the dream that shaped her teenage years, but beneath her diligence and ambition, Andrea also harbored tendencies toward perfectionism and introversion. She was the kind of student who, if she scored a 98 on a test, worried about the missing 2 points rather than celebrating the achievement. Friends remembered her as caring but sometimes withdrawn, a girl who carried an invisible burden she rarely shared. By high school, she was excelling not only academically, but also physically. Andrea was a strong swimmer, and she competed on her school team, pushing her body through the water with the same discipline she applied to her studies. She was active in extracurricular activities, including the National Honor Society, and graduated in 1982 as her class valedictorian. She was the kind of daughter and student who seemed destined to do everything right, the kind who checked all the boxes of success, who appeared to the outside world as nearly flawless. After graduation, Andrea enrolled in the University of Texas School of Nursing in Houston. She was methodical, focused, determined to achieve her goal of becoming a registered nurse. The training was demanding, but Andrea thrived. She was capable of memorizing complex procedures, understanding medical terminology, and handling the intense pressures of patient care. Upon completing her degree, she began working as a registered nurse at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country. There, surrounded by the relentless fight against cancer, Andrea proved herself capable and dependable. Colleagues described her as diligent, compassionate with patients, and attentive to detail. Yet even in this thriving professional environment, she was quiet, almost painfully reserved. She didn't chase social outings or revel in youthful recklessness. Instead, she kept to herself, saving her energy for the controlled environment of work. She was a caretaker by profession, but she also carried within herself an intense need to be perfect in that role. By her mid-20s, Andrea's life appeared on track. She had a stable career, a clear sense of purpose, and no outward sign of the mental illness that would later consume her. But life was about to shift when she met a man named Russell "Rusty" Yates. Rusty was studying engineering at Auburn University in Alabama, and by the time he met Andrea in 1989, he was working for NASA in Houston as a design engineer. He was ambitious, focused, and deeply religious. Rusty and Andrea connected almost instantly, bonding over their shared goals of stability, family, and faith. Where Andrea was quiet and methodical, Rusty was ambitious and confident. Together, they created the image of a couple destined for a solid, purposeful life. From the beginning of their courtship, Rusty spoke about wanting a large family, inspired by the teachings of conservative religious communities that valued procreation and traditional roles. Andrea, eager to please and drawn to the idea of nurturing children, embraced this vision. They married in 1993 and wasted little time before beginning the family they both dreamed of. Their first home was modest, but Rusty soon pushed for a lifestyle modeled after a preacher they admired, a man named Michael Warnicki, who preached about living simply, rejecting materialism, and embracing the purest form of Christianity. Under his influence, Rusty and Andrea sold their possessions, moved into a small trailer, and later into a converted bus. They embraced a life of minimalism, believing that material comfort was a temptation that distracted from spiritual purity. By 1994, Andrea gave birth to their first child, a boy named Noah. Holding her baby for the first time awakened in Andrea the nurturing instinct she had long carried. She adored her son, doting on him with devotion. But behind the tender moments of early motherhood, cracks began to appear. Andrea's perfectionism made her hypervigilant, anxious about whether she was doing everything right. She set impossibly high standards for herself as a mother, fearing failure at every turn. Within a few years, the family grew quickly. John was born in 1995, Paul in 1997, and Luke in 1999. Each child brought Andrea joy, but also deepening stress. The cramped conditions of their living arrangements, combined with the isolation of home life and the constant pressure of caring for 4 young children, began to weigh on her. While Rusty worked long hours, Andrea managed the household almost entirely alone. Her mental health began to decline after the birth of Luke. She experienced bouts of depression, feelings of worthlessness, and moments of paranoia. At times, she believed she was failing her children, or worse, that she was destined to harm them. She confided some of these fears to Rusty, but both of them viewed it through the lens of faith and duty. Not as an urgent medical crisis. In 1999, Andrea attempted suicide for the first time, overdosing on pills. It was a chilling signal of how far her mental state had deteriorated. Hospitalized and later treated with antidepressants, she improved temporarily, but the cycle soon repeated. That same year, she attempted suicide again, this time by holding a knife to her own neck. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility, where doctors diagnosed her with severe postpartum depression and psychosis. It was during these years that Andrea's inner world began to fracture. She heard voices. She experienced delusions that television sets were sending her messages. She became convinced that Satan himself was targeting her and her children. Her faith, once a source of comfort, now intertwined with her paranoia. Fueling terrifying visions, doctors urged Andrea and Rusty not to have more children, warning that each pregnancy compounded her risk of psychosis. But the Yates family's commitment to their faith and their vision of a large household of children overrode medical advice. Against the warnings, Andrea became pregnant again. On November 30th, 2000, she gave birth to Mary, their 5th child. Andrea adored her baby girl, but the weight of caring for 5 children under the age of 7, combined with her fragile mental state, became unbearable. By early 2001, she was once again slipping into the abyss of psychosis. She withdrew from friends and family, stopped eating properly, and descended into a state of catatonia. At times, she sat silently, staring into space, unable to respond to even simple questions. Hospitalizations followed. Doctors prescribed her a cocktail of medications, including Haldol, a powerful antipsychotic. For a brief period, she improved, regaining enough clarity to care for her children again. Rusty, believing his wife was stable, pushed for her to resume normal life. But Andrea herself feared relapse, telling doctors and family members that she was still plagued by thoughts of harming her children. By the summer of 2001, Andrea was standing on the precipice. She had been hospitalized multiple times, attempted suicide, and confided her darkest thoughts. She feared she was a bad mother, unworthy of her children, incapable of saving them from the devil she believed lurked around every corner. Her life had become a relentless cycle of caring, collapsing, recovering, and returning to the same impossible routine. And on the morning of June 20th, 2001, the storm that had been building for years finally broke. The birth of Mary in late 2000 should have been a joyful moment for Andrea Yates. She finally had a daughter after 4 sons, and her friends described how she glowed when she held her baby. Yet behind her tired smile, Andrea was slipping further into the abyss. The warnings from doctors had been stark. Another pregnancy could shatter her already fragile mental state. Still, she had gone through with it, partly because of faith, partly because Rusty insisted they were strong enough as a family to manage. But Andrea knew, she felt it in her bones, that she was walking closer to a cliff she could not turn back from. By early 2001, Andrea was unraveling. Her depression had deepened into something far more sinister. She became withdrawn, her voice flat, her eyes glassy. She paced the house endlessly, unable to rest. She refused to feed herself properly, and some days she wouldn't speak at all. At other times, she would mutter that she was unworthy, that she was a terrible mother, that her children would be damaged by her presence. Rusty worked long hours at NASA, convinced that the best way to support the family was to provide financially. But Andrea's days alone in the cramped house were suffocating. She was often left with 5 children under the age of 7, and the walls seemed to close in tighter each week. The chaos of toys, the crying of babies, the constant demands of toddlers, for a woman already fragile. It was like living inside a hurricane with no door to escape through. Her mental decline accelerated in March 2001. Andrea attempted to drown herself, slipping into the bathtub and holding her breath, but the survival instinct pulled her back. She confessed the attempt to Rusty and later to doctors, who immediately placed her under psychiatric care again. She was given stronger doses of Haldol, and for a brief period, she seemed to improve. The medication stabilized her delusions, silenced the voices, and lifted her from catatonia, but Andrea's illness was relentless. Each time she stabilized, the medications would be reduced or stopped. Doctors struggled to balance her treatment. One physician recommended that Andrea never be left alone with the children, a warning that in hindsight should have been carved in stone. But Rusty believed she was improving and encouraged her to return to her routine as quickly as possible. Complicating Andrea's fragile recovery were the voices of faith around her. The preacher Michael Warrenicki, whose teachings had influenced the Yates family for years, sent letters and sermons that weighed heavily on Andrea. His words painted vivid pictures of sin, damnation, and the narrow path to salvation. Andrea, already consumed with guilt and fear, interpreted these messages as confirmation that she was failing spiritually. She began to believe she had damned her children simply by being their mother, that they were marked for hell unless she intervened. By May 2001, Andrea's condition was deteriorating again. She mutilated herself, tearing at her scalp and pulling out chunks of her hair. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. At times she simply sat, motionless, staring at the floor. Rusty tried to comfort her, but his optimism clashed with her reality. He told her she just needed to think positive, that she would get better. Andrea, sinking deeper into psychosis, could no longer grasp the hope he offered. On May 3rd, Andrea was admitted to Devereux, Texas Treatment Network, where she was seen by psychiatrist Dr. Mohammed Saeed. He adjusted her medications and noted her severe depression and psychosis. Andrea confided that she was hearing voices, that she felt Satan was inside her, that she believed she was a terrible mother. Still, after short treatment and modest improvement, she was released home. Within 2 weeks, the cycle repeated. Andrea briefly improved, then relapsed. She was admitted again, stabilized again, discharged again. The family did not fully grasp how dangerous her condition was, or perhaps they simply could not face it. Friends urged Rusty to keep Andrea hospitalized longer. Doctors urged caution, but in June 2001, Andrea was back at home, alone with the children for hours each day. The same impossible environment that had driven her into crisis before. In those final weeks before the crime, Andrea's thoughts grew darker. She told her mother she felt overwhelmed, that she couldn't handle 5 children anymore. She confided to her doctors that she had visions of harming the kids, that she feared they would grow up damaged and doomed. Her religious delusions intensified. She began to believe her children were not safe in this world, that by dying young, they could be saved from eternal damnation. On June 18th, just 2 days before the tragedy, Rusty found Andrea in the bathroom filling the tub with water. When he asked why, she said she just needed to wash the children. It seemed innocent enough in the moment, but in retrospect, it was the chilling rehearsal of what was about to happen. The following day, June 19th, Andrea took the children to her parents' house. Her mother, sensing Andrea's fragility, urged her to come stay with them, to take a break from the crushing demands of motherhood. Andrea promised she would. She seemed quiet, worn out, but not outwardly dangerous. Rusty remained convinced she was improving, but inside Andrea's mind, the decision had already been made. She was convinced Satan had taken hold of her, that her children would be eternally damned if she didn't act. She believed she was a bad mother, and that by ending their lives she could save their souls. The delusion was absolute, consuming every corner of her mind. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty left for work at NASA around 9 a.m., leaving Andrea alone with Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. It was an ordinary morning on the outside, a day like any other in suburban Clear Lake. But for Andrea, it was the moment she believed she had been preparing for. The house was quiet. The children played, laughed, moved about with the innocence of youth. And Andrea walked into the bathroom, filled the tub with water, and prepared to do the unthinkable. She carried 6-month-old Mary first. The baby was light in her arms, soft, unaware. Andrea lowered her into the water and held her down until her small body stopped moving. She lifted her out, dripping and still, and placed her gently in the bed, covering her with a sheet as though tucking her in for sleep. Next came 2-year-old Luke, a toddler with a mop of hair and wide eyes. Luke squirmed and resisted as his mother carried him to the tub. But Andrea's grip was firm, her mind locked in the delusion that this act was saving him. She submerged him, held him until he no longer struggled, then laid his body beside Mary's. 3-year-old Paul was next. Playful, trusting, he didn't fully understand what was happening. Andrea repeated the ritual, the same chilling process, then laid him beside his siblings. 5-year-old John followed. At his age, he was old enough to panic, to thrash, to fight for air. But Andrea was methodical, her psychosis rendering her unstoppable. When his body went limp, she placed him with the others, a row of her children lined up, lifeless. Only one remained. 7-year-old Noah, the eldest, the one who had seen his mother take his siblings. When Andrea came for him, he ran. He bolted through the house, crying, realizing with the clarity of a child who suddenly sees death approaching. "No, Mommy," he cried. He darted toward the backyard, toward the open air. But Andrea caught him before he could escape. She dragged him to the bathroom, despite his struggles, and forced him into the tub. Noah's fight was the hardest. He was bigger, stronger, desperate. But Andrea's delusion had given her the conviction of someone who believed she was doing God's will. She held him under until he, too, was gone. She then pulled him from the tub, soaked and heavy, and laid him with the others. In less than an hour, Andrea had drowned all 5 of her children. The silence that followed was heavy. The house that had once echoed with laughter and cries was now still. Andrea, exhausted but calm, walked to the phone. She dialed 911. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic. She told the operator she needed police, that she had drowned her children. The dispatcher asked questions, trying to comprehend what was being said, but Andrea repeated it plainly, as though reporting an accident. After hanging up, she called Rusty at work. Her voice on the other end of the line was steady. "You need to come home," she told him. "It's time." Rusty asked why. Andrea's reply was chilling. "It's the children." He rushed out of NASA. Unaware of the nightmare that awaited him, police and paramedics arrived first. When they entered the home, they were met with a sight that would haunt them forever. 5 small bodies laid out in a row, lifeless, as though prepared for burial. The bathtub water still ran. Andrea sat quietly, waiting. She did not resist arrest. She admitted calmly to what she had done, explaining in fragmented sentences that her children were not developing right, that she was saving them from Satan. Word of the crime spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors stood in disbelief as patrol cars and ambulances crowded the Yates' front yard. Reporters quickly descended, their cameras capturing the shocked expressions of friends and community members who couldn't reconcile the quiet. Devoted mother they thought they knew with the horror inside her home. Rusty arrived shortly after, his world collapsing before he even crossed the threshold. Officers stopped him, sparing him the sight of what Andrea had done. The grief was immediate, shattering. In one morning, he had lost all 5 of his children. Andrea was taken into custody without struggle. She sat in the police car, her face blank, her body calm. She was not a wild-eyed killer or a mother in hysterics. She was eerily composed, still lost in the delusions that had driven her. She told detectives that her children were not right, that she feared they would become criminals, that she had to stop Satan from taking them for law enforcement. It was one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. For the world, once the news broke, it became almost incomprehensible. A mother drowning 5 children in her own bathtub defied the boundaries of imagination. But behind the shock lay the complex and terrifying truth of untreated postpartum psychosis. Andrea spent her first night in custody in a mental health unit, under close watch. Doctors who evaluated her immediately noted her flat affect, her detachment, her delusional thinking. She wasn't hiding guilt. She truly believed she had saved her children. Outside, the media storm raged. Headlines screamed of a mother's massacre. Talk shows debated whether she was a monster or a victim of mental illness. Neighbors reeled from grief and disbelief. Rusty faced a tidal wave of scrutiny. Some saw him as another victim. Others accused him of ignoring years of warnings. And the 5 small caskets lined up for burial drove home the unbearable reality. 5 innocent lives, ended by the hands of their mother. Andrea herself, though, remained locked in a mental fog, unable to grieve in the way the world expected. She spoke in flat, matter-of-fact tones about what she had done, convinced that she had fulfilled some grim duty. In her mind, she hadn't destroyed her children. She had saved them. The stage was now set for one of the most sensational and divisive trials in American history. Andrea Yates sat in the Harris County Jail in Houston, her days a blur of interviews with lawyers, visits from psychiatrists, and the numbing routine of confinement. She was on suicide watch, kept under observation, because even after taking the lives of her 5 children, she still talked about ending her own. She was medicated, evaluated, and examined. But even under heavy drugs, her delusions bled through. She insisted that her children were better off, that she had been compelled to do what she did, that Satan had been whispering in her ear from the moment of her arrest. Andrea's case was destined to ignite national debate. The crime itself was so incomprehensible, a mother systematically drowning her children, that people struggled to frame it. Was she a cold-blooded murderer, fully aware of her actions? Or was she a desperately ill woman, consumed by postpartum psychosis so severe that she no longer lived in the same reality as everyone else? The prosecution wasted no time painting her as responsible. District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal argued that Andrea knew what she was doing. She filled the bathtub, she killed the children one by one, she called 911. Those, he argued, were deliberate actions of a woman who understood her choices and their consequences. The state charged her with capital murder, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. The defense, led by attorney George Parnham, countered that Andrea was profoundly ill. They presented her history, the suicide attempts, the hospitalizations, the hallucinations, the delusions about Satan. Psychiatrist after psychiatrist testified that Andrea was not sane on June 20th, 2001, that she was suffering from a severe mental disease that obliterated her ability to distinguish right from wrong. The trial in 2002 became a spectacle. Courtrooms filled with reporters. Outside, protesters gathered, some demanding justice for the children through execution, others carrying signs that read, "Mental illness is not murder." Talk shows dissected every detail. While legal analysts debated insanity defenses and public outrage simmered, Rusty Yates sat through the proceedings. His grief palpable, but his loyalty to Andrea complicated everything. He insisted that she was a good mother who had been broken by illness, not an evil woman. His words did little to sway public fury. Many blamed him too, for pushing Andrea to keep having children despite medical warnings, for leaving her alone when doctors had told him not to, for failing to protect his family from disaster. Rusty became a lightning rod for judgment. Though in his own mind, he was simply a husband who had believed in his wife's strength during the trial. Andrea herself appeared passive, medicated, her face expressionless. When photographs of her children were shown, she did not break down the way some expected. Instead, she sat still, occasionally whispering responses to her lawyers. To the prosecution, this was proof she lacked remorse. To the defense, it was evidence of her psychotic detachment. One of the most controversial moments came from the prosecution's expert witness, psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz. He testified that Andrea had likely been influenced by television, that she had seen an episode of Law and Order where a woman drowned her children and was acquitted by reason of insanity. The implication was that Andrea had staged her actions deliberately to craft an insanity defense. The testimony was powerful. It swayed the jury toward believing she had planned the murders with cunning. But there was one glaring problem. No such episode of Law and Order existed. Dr. Dietz had been mistaken, or perhaps careless. Still, the damage was done. The jury never heard a correction during deliberations. In March 2002, Andrea Yates was found guilty of capital murder. She was spared the death penalty but sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The verdict sent shockwaves. Many were horrified that a severely ill woman had been convicted instead of treated. Others celebrated what they saw as justice for 5 murdered children. Andrea was sent to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Her days now confined not just by mental illness, but by concrete walls and barbed wire. But the story did not end there. Andrea's lawyers appealed, pointing to Dr. Yates's false testimony. In 2005, the Texas Court of Appeals overturned her conviction, ruling that the jury had been tainted by the misinformation. A retrial was ordered by 2006. Andrea Yates once again faced a jury. This time, the insanity defense was central, and without the false testimony clouding the proceedings, the case was clearer. Psychiatrists described her psychosis in excruciating detail, her delusions that Satan was inside her, that her children were marked for eternal damnation, that only by killing them young could she save them. They explained how postpartum psychosis is not simply depression, but a complete detachment from reality, a storm of hallucinations and delusions so powerful it hijacks the mind. This time, the jury listened. After 3 days of deliberation, they found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, she was committed to Kerrville State Hospital, a high-security mental health facility in Texas. She would remain there indefinitely, undergoing treatment. Her freedom gone, but her punishment reframed as medical rather than criminal. The retrial's outcome reignited national debate. Some were outraged, believing Andrea had escaped justice. Others saw it as a long overdue recognition of the devastating power of mental illness. For advocates of maternal health, the case became a rallying cry to raise awareness of postpartum depression and psychosis. Laws and policies began to shift, with states mandating more education for new mothers, screening for postpartum symptoms, and greater access to psychiatric care. Rusty Yates, devastated but resilient, eventually divorced Andrea. He remarried, but never stopped insisting that his first wife had been a victim of a condition beyond her control. He visited her occasionally, though the visits dwindled with time. Andrea, meanwhile, settled into the routine of hospital life, medicated, supervised, forever haunted by the 5 lives she had taken. Today, Andrea remains in a mental health facility. She spends her days quietly, painting, knitting, sometimes participating in therapy. She rarely speaks to the press, though those who have interviewed her describe a woman who understands, at last, the magnitude of what she did, but who still believes, on some level, that she was trying to protect her children. The Andrea Yates case endures as one of the most infamous in American history. It is remembered not only for the horror of the act, but for the difficult questions it forced society to confront. How should the law treat mentally ill offenders? What responsibilities do families have when medical warnings are given? How much blame lies with a mother overtaken by psychosis? And how much with a system that failed to protect her and her children? 5 small headstones in a Houston cemetery mark the cost of those unanswered questions. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. Their lives were brief. Their deaths tragic. Their memories a constant reminder of what happens when illness collides with neglect, when warnings are ignored, and when faith and delusion become indistinguishable in the mind of someone suffering. Andrea's story is not one of a monster in the traditional sense. It is the story of a woman undone by biology, trauma, and faith, who became the instrument of unimaginable tragedy. It is also the story of a legal system struggling to balance justice with mercy, and a society forced to acknowledge that sometimes the greatest danger to children is not strangers in the night, but a disease that can hollow out the heart of a mother.